Hello, my name is Mike Horrigan. I am the president of the Upjohn Institute for Employment Research, and today I'm delighted to have Tim Bartick here to talk about his recent research, which documents the large and economic and social benefits from targeting job creation at distressed communities and local labor markets. This work is part of a joint project with Katie Bolter, who manages our Policies for Place program at the Institute. Now, the Policies for Place program focuses on identifying policies that promote community prosperity and prosperities that help local residents get and keep good jobs. So Tim, to start, your research talks about local labor markets quite a bit. What is a local labor market? How do you define it?
Well, a local labor market is a multi-county area that has sufficient internal commuting flows that if you make a change, that if there's some kind of job creation in one part of the local labor market, in one of the counties, it affects workers throughout the multi-county area. So, I mean, that obviously makes some sense in terms of community. If you just think about it, if you're a worker in a central city county and a job is created in a suburban county,
right.
If you can commute to that job, then that job creation gives you greater job availability. It affects, your labor market prospects. But it's even true for central city workers, say, who don't have cars, who can't commute, because if a job is created in a suburban county, someone may take that job who previously was working in the central city county. That opens up a job vacancy, and again, that will improve your odds of finding a job. So the idea, if there's enough commuting, then a job shock, a job creation in one part of the area affects everyone. Now, there are a lot of different definitions that different government agencies use of local labor markets. I'm sure most people have heard of metropolitan areas. That's one definition.
Right.
In this research, I use commuting zones. And for commuting zones, there are about 3,000 counties, a little more than 3,000 counties in the United States. And they're divided into roughly a little more than 600 commuting zones, multi-county areas that contain most commuting flows in which, and that therefore workers care about jobs created anywhere in the commuting zone.
So with a commuting zone, that's a really interesting definition. Is there sort of a standard in terms of how far you would have to travel within the commuting zone?
No, it just looks at volume of commuting and says if there's sufficient volume of commuting in terms of how many commuters there are versus the population, you put count. It at some point becomes somewhat arbitrary. I mean, it's a little
right.
If there's a little bit of commuting, but essentially you try to group areas together within which you think there's enough commuting that labor market conditions tend to spread.
So in a smaller area, you might have 2 or 3 counties that are a commuting zone, but in a larger, like Oakland County, that might be its own commuting zone.
Yeah, and then you go to extreme. I think you sometimes get commuting zones of 24 or 25 counties. I mean, they're very big. I mean, New York is pretty big. So,
all right. So with that definition of a commuting zone, and you're looking at that, and you're looking at how job creation affects distressed local labor markets. What is that impact? What's new in your research in terms of how you're actually measuring the impacts of policies to create jobs?
Well, I'm focusing in my research on employment rates, employment population ratios for so-called prime age workers. We were workers ages 25 to 54. So why am I focusing on that? Well, first of all, you want to control somewhat for age mix. I mean, you wouldn't want to say an area is economically distressed because the employment to population ratio is low because you have a lot of retirees or a lot of students, both of which are groups that tend to have lower employment rates.
Right.
So prime age workers are those ages 25 to 54. Generally, most of them are working. You hope most of them are working, and most of them want jobs. So I focus on the employment rate particularly because there's a lot of research showing the employment rate's a key driver of social benefits and social costs. So if the employment rate is low,
right.
Not only does this directly affect those workers, if you don't have a job, earnings per capita tends to be lower. It also puts downward pressure on wages in the local area. There's a lot of unemployed workers competing for jobs, so the wage rate's down. It also, we know, a lower employment rate in an area is associated with higher rates of substance abuse, higher rates of crime, more family breakups. And in fact, we've shown that a lower employment rate is associated with worse prospects for children growing up in such communities long term. In other words, those children, possibly due to their parents having more problems, but partially even due to other people in the community. In other words, there could be effects due to not having enough adult role models around who are employed, or it could be job network effects. Fewer people with jobs means less, you don't hear about jobs. Now, when I define distress, it's somewhat arbitrary where you classify distress, but essentially, I define distress as the so-called 10th percentile of employment rates in the nation. In other words, you set a cutoff for the prime age employment rate so that 10% of the U.S. population lives in areas that are at or below that rate. And that's about 4 or 5 percentage points below the U.S. average. Right now, the U.S. prime age employment rate is about 81%.
Okay.
And so a distressed area might have an employment rate at 76 percentage points. 76% of prime age workers are working. On the other hand, a booming area might be 4 or 5 percentage points higher. And might have an employment rate of 85, 86%. So the gap between a booming area and a distressed area is 9 or 10 percentage points. And that's a huge difference for a worker. If you're going out looking for a job, if 76% of workers in prime age are employed, it's a lot harder to find a job than if 86% are employed.
Because that area has more job opportunities.
That's more job opportunities. Right. So we care about employment rates because they're a major driver of social benefits and cost. And we focus on the prime age rate, not that we don't want older people to work or younger people to work, but because a lot of older workers, they're retired, and that's good. A lot of younger workers are in school, and that's good. So we focus on the prime age group, where we expect those people to work.
Well, and those areas that you're talking about may have different features that are attractive to, say, retirement, for example.
Right. And in terms of the geography of this in the U.S., the areas that are distressed in the U.S. include a lot of the rural South, a lot of Appalachia, but it also includes lots of parts of upstate New York, many rural counties in Michigan and the UP. It also includes a number of cities. For example, if you look at California, obviously we think of California in terms of booming coastal cities like San Francisco, San Diego. But if you look at the inland cities, places like Fresno, they have very low employment rates. And so a lot of California outside of the booming coastal cities is economically distressed. And so there are these disparities even within a state.
So you have a commuting zone, and you're looking at employment rate. You're looking at the proportion of prime age population that are working, that are employed. But within the commuting zone, you already mentioned that it may have several counties. Is it possible for a commuting zone to have both distress and be thriving in different areas?
Well, frequently it is. I mean, we have cases where you might have a central city county that is 4 or 5 percentage points below the overall commuting zone average in terms of prime age employment rate. And you might have a suburban county that's 4 or 5 percentage points above. So for example, in Michigan, I mean, a good example of that would be the Detroit area. Detroit's in Wayne County, and then you have a suburban county, Oakland County.
Right.
And Oakland County, basically, Detroit, Wayne County has an employment rate that's about 10 percentage points below that of Oakland County. So there's this, in addition to having disparities across commuting zones, you have some disparities within commuting zones. Obviously, there's some variation. Some commuting zones are more uniform, but there certainly are many large central city type commuting zones in which there's this city-suburban differential that is quite stark.
So one of the important features of public policy is to figure out, with scarce resources, with the dollars available, where do you target policy? And I guess the question I have is, in your writing, it seems like your recommendation is, let's target the job creation funds, resources, on the most distressed communities.
Right, and the thing to emphasize, my research, what's new in my research, I'm trying to make a case for this. Not simply based on, okay, we're trying to target the distressed communities because they're worse off, because it's actually better for the state and the nation as a whole for doing that. So, there had been some previous research prior to my research that found that you look at short-term job creation, you find some differentials in terms of how job creation affects employment rates. And so the differentials you would find is that if you take a distressed area, compare the distressed local labor market compared to an average local labor market, maybe the effect on the employment rate would be 30% greater in the distressed area.
Okay.
And in the case of a distressed area versus the booming area, there would be effects in both, and maybe in the distressed area be 60% better. Now, my research is looking instead at long-term effects of job creation. So after 15 or 16 years, what happens if you create jobs and you consider like the following thought experiment. We create jobs either in a distressed commuting zone, an average commuting zone, or a booming commuting zone. In a booming commuting zone, the answer in my research in the long term, it has no effects on the employment rate.
Oh, none?
You bring the jobs in, all that happens is population moves in. Now that has some benefits, but not as much as boosting the employment rate does. On the other hand, the differential between the average commuting zone and a distressed commuting zone is much greater than the 30% the previous research has found. It's actually 3 times as great. The effect in the distressed commuting zone is 3 times as great as that in an average commuting zone. So it means that now the implications of this is that not only is it equitable, fairer to maybe create jobs in distressed areas, it actually can raise the national employment rate or the state employment rate. In other words, in terms of like we're debating federal policy now about inflation, how do we get people in jobs without excessive inflationary pressures? One of the implications of this research is if we're able to target job creation so that it goes into a distressed commuting zone, you can actually raise the employment rate that the nation as a whole can sustain without excess inflationary pressures. So it makes the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve has this, as you know, has this
Right.
dual mandate. We want to have maximum employment without excessive inflationary pressures. Well, one way you can do that is targeting job creation at distressed commuting zones. And my research suggests that there are tremendous potential national benefits, for that matter, state benefits. If a state reallocates jobs to more distressed areas of the state, it can raise the overall employment rate in that state.
So you mentioned these are long-term results. So is this sort of job creation policies in year one, or is it job creation policies over several years and then looking at the long-term results?
Well, I'm focusing more on the long-term, policy. So, the long-term policies might be things like, so when we're talking job creation, how do we create jobs in the U.S.?
Right.
Well, I mean, the most obvious thing that we devote a lot of resources to are state and local economic development policies. So states currently are devoting roughly $80 billion a year to various types of ways of increasing job growth in different areas of the state. And that's mostly in the form of business tax incentives. So there are these deals where either for a firm that's locating or expanding in a state, you offer them some kind of big tax break, or in some cases you just write them a check. You write them a check and say, well, you're creating so many jobs, we're writing you a check for that amount, it's a certain amount. We also have other programs, though, that provide services to firms. And, I've argued in the past that some of these services, such as customized job training and manufacturing extension and infrastructure, creating industrial sites, can be more cost-effective, have a lower cost per job created. Now, the thing with business tax incentives, they tend to be costly per job created. And why are they costly? They're costly because not every firm that you offer an incentive to is actually induced because of the incentive. A lot of the firms you offer incentives to would have come to your state anyway. Or if they wouldn't have come to the state, some other firm would have found the same site. I mean, you have a site, it's empty, it's got an empty factory there, say.
Right.
And workers in the area. If one firm doesn't choose that, at some point some other firm might do it. So the effects of these programs on job creation are not as great as people sometimes think. They can be very costly per net job actually induced. So one of the issues is if it's costly to create jobs, where should you target that? And my research suggests you need to target distressed commuting zones. I should also mention that my research, one of the other new things in my research is that it also matters which county within the commuting zone you create jobs in. In other words, one of the implications of the research, that I look at counties, not just commuting zones. And one of the things I find is that it makes a difference, and it makes enough of a difference that, say, in an average commuting zone, if there's a distressed central city county and a better off suburban county, that creating jobs in the suburban county would have no effect on the overall employment rate in the commuting zone. Creating jobs in a distressed county would. Now, in a distressed commuting zone, it doesn't make, creating jobs anywhere in the commuting zone will have high employment rate effects. But the implications of this research is that policymakers should be more concerned about where the jobs are located. If jobs are in a distressed commuting zone, you should be willing to pay more money to create jobs there. And if jobs are in a distressed county, say within an average commuting zone, you should also be willing to devote more resources to creating jobs in such a county.
That's really interesting. So the example you gave before of Wayne County and Oakland,
right?
You'd be sort of doing job creation within Wayne County rather than Oakland.
Right, and though, there'd be some benefits to creating jobs in Oakland County, but they'd be greater in Wayne County because there are more non-employed workers there available for work, and we'd lower some of the social cost of non-employment. We would not only help people immediately through lower crime, lower substance abuse, but later on, 30 years from now, the kids growing up in a higher employment rate environment are going to be doing better off.
Right.
So it has these very important long-run effects.
So you talk a lot about job creation and job creation programs. Can you give examples of what we mean by a job creation program, sort of how they work, what they are?
Well, as I said, a lot of them are these business tax incentives, and they vary across the states, but sometimes they're property tax abatements. We don't charge the company the normal property tax rate.
Yeah.
Some of these are job creation tax credits. Some are straight grant programs. There are a number of states that just write a check. Some are programs where we allow a company to keep its workers' state income tax withholdings for 5, 10, or 15 years. So we say to a company, if you locate here, instead of turning over the withheld state income taxes to the state, you can keep it. We'll still credit the worker as if they had paid the money to the state. But you get to keep it. So, in a state where, like Michigan, the income tax rate is 4%, 4.1%. Essentially, it's like a little over 4% wage subsidy for a number of years. And Michigan's had programs like that in the past. Many states have programs like that. As I said, that's one way to create jobs. You also can create jobs through some of these customized services. And for that matter, of course, although we haven't done so today, both in this country and other countries, you can create various types of public service jobs.
Mm-hmm.
In the Great Depression, we had the WPA, the CCC. We directly created jobs. Or for that matter, you can create jobs through simply aiding state and local governments. If you provide more funds to state and local governments in a distressed community to hire more police officers or to hire more school teachers, that's a direct public service job creation. And that's another way you can create jobs locally beyond these economic development programs.
So one of the conversations that I've been having with economic developers is that it's not just those programs that you're talking about, but also the wraparound services, the kinds of barriers that people face in a distressed area, such as childcare issues, transportation issues. Is that part of what you need to do in a distressed area?
Right. I would say that you need to look at, the research I'm looking at asks the question, if you just create jobs, what's the employment rate? And I find it makes a big difference where you create the jobs. But I certainly would say that a lot also depends on when you create jobs. What essentially happens when you create jobs in an area, any new jobs you create are filled in 3 ways. Either they're filled by local workers already employed, or they're filled, that's source one, local workers are employed. They're filled by local workers who aren't employed, or they're filled by in-migrants. But the jobs that are filled by local workers who are already employed creates a job vacancy filled in the same 3 ways. So you have these job vacancy chains. Ultimately, any new job created results in either a local worker who is not employed getting a job or an in-migrant getting a job. There's no other alternative. Now, who gets hired along those hiring chains? Well, that partly depends on how many non-employed workers are available, which is what I'm looking at. But it also depends on what programs you have, as you're mentioning.
The barriers.
In other words, if you have a job training program that is really well done in the following ways. First of all, they have people in the job training program who know about job vacancies, who are able to communicate appropriate job vacancies to appropriate workers who are not employed or underemployed. And furthermore, if they're able to get workers the requisite training that they can actually not only get the job, but keep it, if they can provide a success coach who can help the worker overcome any problems, if they can help the worker find childcare that's reliable and dependable, if they can make sure that the worker has a used car that's reliable, or if it breaks down, then it gets fixed rapidly. All these things can affect, there are all these firms making hiring decisions along these vacancy chains. They have to decide, am I going to maybe take what I might see as a risk on a worker who is not employed or underemployed? Or am I going to simply advertise the job and maybe it goes to someone moving in from somewhere else?
Right.
And, you know, not that I'm against people from somewhere else getting a job, but in terms of benefits for, say, I mean, if Michigan is looking at, we want to benefit Michigan residents through how we run our economic development job training programs, it would clearly make some sense to structure them so that hopefully we create jobs in the areas where there are the most shortage jobs, one, and two, wherever we create jobs, that we try to make sure that job access, particularly for people unemployed or underemployed, is as good as possible. And that, you know, that frequently requires some type of assistance that is, you know, that is customized to the needs of the individual workers. It's not a something you can do through a one-size-fits-all policy, because every worker has different challenges to getting and keeping jobs.
And the marginalized communities that may be there also have different challenges. There may be an immigrant community, there may be language issues, just a lot of different things you have to address.
Well, yeah, you can't do a one-size-fits-all of this.
Right.
This is one area where, you know, sometimes I think that at higher levels of government, the federal government has, you know, mentality, we're going to set this program, here's how it's going to be structured,
Right.
We need this, this, and this. But different communities may need different things. I mean, you know, transit access, you know, mass transit access is quite different in Chicago than it is in Kalamazoo.
Right, right.
And you know, just because of the history and the size of the area and the historical transit system, so it's a whole different issue. As to, and that's true of many, you know, most of the U.S. You do need to, you know, obviously we'd like to improve mass transit, but you also may need to get some people a reliable used car or some kind of van service
Sure.
or some kind of shared cars or some way you can get to work. And not have to lose your job because your car breaks down and you don't have the money to get fixed.
Right. So this has been a wide-ranging discussion, but if you had a chance to talk to a key policymaker, somebody who can design a program, what kind of advice would you give them? What's the general sort of bottom line story that you'd like to give them?
Well, I would like to encourage policymakers to take more of a risk, a political risk, on targeting job creation. And what I mean by political risk, it's very hard for both the state government, any state policymaker, or for that matter, the federal government, to target resources on distressed communities. Why is it hard? Well, distressed communities tend not to have quite the same political clout as
Right.
non-distressed communities. They, a lot of times, people there may not have as much political power. And in addition, just in politics, I mean, the nice thing to do is you sprinkle goodies, you sprinkle your programs over everyone.
Right.
You know, you need to get everyone's vote, so you sprinkle programs everywhere. So there's a little bit of a political hit from targeting. But one of the lessons of my research is that targeting has potentially enormous economic benefits. It's not simply a feel-good, let's help the disadvantaged, although, you know, there's certainly an ethical and moral argument for doing that. But leaving that aside, there's a hard-headed economics argument, which is by targeting more marginalized communities, those with low employment rates, you actually can raise the overall employment rate either your state or the nation as a whole can achieve. You actually can grow the overall economic pie. And that's, so it's worth taking some maybe short-run political hit if in the long run you can uplift these areas so that they can help grow the entire economy so it's bigger, and so in the end we're going to have more resources to help everyone. So, you know, let's encourage people to realize that in the short term maybe it's not good politics to target distressed communities. In the long term, it's not only good economics, but potentially good politics, because with a larger economic pie, you can do more for everyone in the long run.
So you have to have the will and discipline to do this.
Right, it's difficult to do. I mean, we've only done it a few times in the past. I mean, you know, the U.S. historically, you know, we had the Tennessee Valley Authority, TVA, that started in the 1930s that targeted the distressed Tennessee Valley with lots of things, especially with rural electrification. And that's been shown that helped that area of the country out quite a bit. There was quite a bit of manufacturing growth in that part of the country. Also, the Appalachian Regional Commission that started in the 1960s and was pretty well funded for 10 or 15 years after that. They put a lot of highways in some of these counties, access highways, and the research shows that the counties that got these access roads did a lot better. So we've done this occasionally for, there's been a political moment that you had the New Deal and and TVA, and then Appalachian Regional Commission came about through a unique political moment. We've had trouble sustaining this at a large scale.
Although we have an opportunity now with the bipartisan infrastructure law, right?
Yeah, well, some of the stuff that's been done in the federal government actually right now has some programs that are targeting distress areas. I mean, there's the Recompete program, there's the Build Back Better Regional Challenge, there are some programs NSF running, some other programs Economic Development Administration is running. But they tend to mostly be at a small scale. The ones that really target distressed areas tend to be being run at pilot levels. They tend to be being run like the $200 million a year, or $500 million a year, $1 billion a year. Now that's obviously okay. So you say $1 billion a year is a small program. But spread over the whole country, it's small. You end up can only help 6 communities, 10 communities, 12 communities, 15 communities with sufficient resources to actually move the needle on job creation, employment rates. And if we're going to help all the distressed places in this country, all the different local labor markets and neighborhoods that lack jobs, we're going to need to do a lot more. I've done various estimates suggesting you probably would need to spend roughly 10 to 20 billion a year for maybe 10 years to really make a sizable dent in the overall displaced place problem. The other thing I would say, other than targeting, that kind of gets back to something you mentioned, not only should you target jobs, but you should try to make sure and try to facilitate job access to those jobs once you create them. So target job creation and accompany job creation programs with job access programs that are coordinated. And all of these need to be customized to each community. I mean, the way you create jobs in Grand Rapids is not the same as Kalamazoo, is not the same as Upper Peninsula, is not the same as upstate New York or rural Tennessee, or one size does not fit all in terms of job creation. And the same is true for job access. One size does not fit all there. So the lesson is, although we need federal and state support for these programs, they have to be run with sufficient flexibility that local areas can come up with the resources they need to come up with solutions that work in that community.
You need local design.
You need local design, local participation. You need to say, look, this area faces these problems. We're going to let them use the funds in a way that makes more sense there. We're not going to have some federal program that says you can only use programs for this, not for this, because that's what we think is needed.
So Tim, I think we could talk about this for 2 more hours, but thank you so much for discussing your research and the policy implications of it. This was delightful.
Okay, thank you.